Hello, my lovelies. Hello, my darlings. Okay, part 5 of An Anarchist Approach to Crime and Justice. New directions and further questions. So, where do we go from here? The widespread disillusionment with accountability processes suggests that we've reached an impasse. We're proposing 4 possible paths to explore, not as solutions to these pitfalls so much as directions for experimenting to see if they can lead to something new. Direction 1. Survivor-led vigilantism. Quote, I wanted revenge. I wanted to make him feel as out of control, scared and vulnerable as he had made me feel. There is no safety really after a sexual assault, but there can be consequence. Angustia, Celeste. Safety is an illusion. Reflections on accountability. 2 situations in which prominent anarchist men were confronted and attacked by groups of women in New York and Santa Cruz made waves in anarchist circles in 2010. The debates that unfolded across our scenes in response to the actions revealed a widespread sense of frustration with existing methods of addressing sexual assault in anarchist scenes. Physical confrontation isn't a new strategy. It was one of the ways survivors responded to their abusers before community accountability. Discourse became widespread in anarchist circles. As accountability strategies developed, many rejected physical confrontation because it hadn't worked to stop rape or keep people safe. The trend of survivor-led vigilantism, accompanied by communiques critiquing accountability process models, reflects the powerlessness and desperation felt by survivors who are searching for alternatives in the face of the futility of the other available options. However, survivor-led vigilantism can be a valid response to sexual assault regardless of the existence of alternatives. One doesn't need to feel powerless or sense the futility of other options to take decisive physical action against one's abuser. This approach offers several advantages. For one, in stark contrast to many accountability processes, it sets realistic goals and succeeds at them. It can feel more empowering and fulfilling than a long, frequently triggering, overly abstract process. Women can use confrontations to build collective power towards other concerted anti-patriarchal action. Physical confrontation sends an unambiguous message that sexual assault is unacceptable. If sexual violence imprints patriarchy on the bodies of women, taking revenge embodies female resistance. Above all, it's unmediated, as the author of the article Notes on Survivor Autonomy and Violence wrote. A common criticism of accountability processes of all varieties is their tendency to mirror some sort of judicial system. Structured mediation towards rehabilitation or punishment of one kind or another. While an outcome dictated by the survivor is certainly not akin to one dictated by the state, the process remains a mediation. Conversely, to move away from this judiciary is to reject mediation, a remnant of the idea that our interactions must be somehow guided by third parties, even third parties we choose ourselves. To that end, an attack on one's rapist is unmediated and direct, precisely that which any judicial system forbids. The line between desire and action is erased. Of course, there are plenty of disadvantages to vigilantism too. Choosing to escalate the situation brings serious risks, both legally and physically. Cops are more likely to bring charges for a group physical assault on a man than an alleged sexual assault. And, as advocates for battered women know, partner violence has a very real possibility to turn deadly. More women are killed by their partners than any other type of attacker. Beyond the immediate risks, you can't beat up a social relationship. As they say, throttling an individual scumbag doesn't do much to make anyone safer or end systematic rape culture, however satisfying it may feel to a vindicated survivor. As mentioned above, the desire to address the roots of rape culture is responding to individual assaults. In responding to individual assaults helped give rise to community accountability efforts in the first place. There's also a legacy of non-survivor accountable vigilantism, a type of male violence that has been widely identified by survivors and anarchist women as being more about masculine ego trips than promoting healing and safety. A critique of this phenomenon comes from Supporting a Survivor of Sexual Assault, a zine orientated towards male allies of survivors. In its discussions of the principle "no more violence," is kicking the rapist's ass going to make the rape not have happened? Will his pain make the survivor go away? Does the survivor need to be trying to chill out another out-of-control violent man? Probably not. Since non-trans men commit the overwhelming majority, some say over 99%, of sexual assaults, men who are supporting a survivor need to be especially conscious of the impact of male violence. It is male violence that causes rape, not what ends it. Your actions must be those of ending male violence. We cannot speak for the responses that survivors, women in particular, may make to rape. If women, as a majority of survivors, decide to collectively respond in a way that involves violence or asking male supporters to participate in violence, that is something for women and survivors to work out for themselves. For men who are supporting a survivor, however, it is absolutely essential that you put aside your desires for masculine retribution and interrupt the cycle of male violence. It is not your responsibility or right to come in vigilante style and take matters into your own hands. This critique influenced the decision of groups like DWOS in Minneapolis to adopt non-violence as a principle. Notice, however, that this critique intentionally does not apply to survivor-led vigilantism, but to unaccountable non-survivor responses. Apologists for anarchist men attacked by survivor-led groups claim that vigilantism is authoritarian. Accountability cannot be a one-way street, or else it becomes a synonym for punitive and policing power. But, as the survivor communiques make clear, vigilantism is not a form of accountability, at least not community accountability based on transformative justice, as it's generally conceived within anarchist circles. It is an explicit rejection of it. It's not a pseudo-judicial process. It declines both state-based and non-state methods of conflict resolution in favour of a direct, unmediated response to harm. Whether or not we think it's appropriate, it shouldn't be mistaken for a form of accountability gone wrong. On the contrary, it is an intentional response to the perceived failure of accountability methods. So long as our practices around accountability for sexual assault and abuse don't successfully meet folks' needs, vigilantism will continue, challenging anarchist advocates of transformative justice to make their ideals a reality. Should we be trying to develop sufficiently effective accountability responses so that vigilantism isn't necessary? Or should we be developing and extending our practices of survivor-led physical confrontation? Direction 2. Prevention through gender-based organising. It's an obvious point, but worth making. Instead of spending all this energy trying to figure out how to support people who've been assaulted and respond to those who assault, wouldn't it make more sense to focus on preventing all this assaulting in the first place? Easier said than done, of course. But so far, we've only discussed reactive, after-the-fact responses to forms of harm that we're assuming will continue even as we figure out better ways to react. To borrow the language of the non-profit Rape Crisis Centre world, responding to assaults and working with assaulters through accountability processes falls under intervention or tertiary prevention. Primary prevention entails preventing first-time assault and abuse through education and by shifting social, cultural and institutional norms, while secondary prevention involves identifying risk factors associated with assault and abuse and intervening to prevent them from escalating. So, we shouldn't necessarily deem responses such as accountability processes failures if sexual assaults continue in anarchist communities. Instead, we should broaden the kinds of preventative work we're doing alongside them. What might we be doing to stop all this from happening in the first place? Outside of anarchist circles, prevention work around gender violence usually centres on education. For women, around self-defence and harm reduction. For men, around combating rape myths and taking responsibility for ending male violence. And, for all, healthy communication and relationship skills. In anarchist circles, some women have mobilised around sharing self-defence skills, and a great deal of popular education, mostly led and conducted by women, has taken place around consent, communication with partners, and positive sexuality. As noted above, while this has noticeably shifted the sexual discourses used by anarchists, we need more extensive engagement with gender oppression to break entrenched patterns. One pathway towards this deeper transformation has come through gender-based collectives, specifically men's groups focusing on changing attitudes towards sexuality and consent among men. However, with a few exceptions such as DWOS in Minneapolis, the Philly Dudes Collective and the Social Detox Zine, there has not been much visible presence in recent years of anti-sexist men's organising among anarchists. Previously, in certain scenes, anti-sexist men's groups allied with autonomous women's organising. These formations are currently out of fashion for a number of reasons, including anti-feminist backlash, a certain understanding of trans and genderqueer politics that labels all gender-based organising as essentialist and problematic, and the absorption of so many committed anti-patriarchy militants of many genders into sexual assault response and accountability work. Could forming anti-sexist men's groups to do assault and abuse prevention work in tandem with autonomous women's organising prove fruitful as another direction in which to experiment? This approach could offer several advantages, creating structures to share skills for dismantling patriarchy, and self-transformation might reduce problematic behaviours among participants while also providing an infrastructure for accountability responses when folks did harm others. Pre-existing men's groups allow folks to take responsibility for self-education and action against patriarchy that doesn't have to be contingent on a perpetrator, label or demands. And folks could be referred to groups for a wide range of behaviours that might not raise eyebrows on their own, but could be warning signs of underlying patriarchal patterns, so that others can intervene before those patterns manifest in more harmful ways, i.e. secondary prevention. For once, we'd have a place to offer folks who, whether by community compulsion or self-motivation, want to work on their shit. But beyond just dealing with problematic behaviours, men's groups provide space for deeper relationship building, learning, political clarification, emotional intimacy, even fun. This should provide incentive for folks to get involved and stay engaged, since it's not centred solely on debilitatingly intense crisis mode accountability work. The kinds of study, reflection and relationship building that take place in these groups can strengthen the other radical organising folks are doing in the anarchist scenes. leaving us with more options, skills and people able to respond in crisis situations. And unlike many internally focused community accountability strategies, men's groups can interact with non-anarchist individuals and groups to spread anti-patriarchal messages and practices while learning from other feminist organising, making our effort relevant to broader social struggles against gender violence and patriarchy. But wait, what about this whole gender thing? Amid the current gender politics of North America anarchist scenes, it's common to view any gender-specific organising as suspect. Isn't this just a remnant of tired identity politics, vestiges of leftist guilt, outdated essentialism and suspiciously authoritarian practices? Don't we want to destroy the gender binary, the real root of patriarchy and gender oppression? And doesn't organising based on gender or assigned gender or whatever just reinforce the patriarchal and transphobic framework we are trying to destroy? Certainly, there are difficult questions to address in determining who counts as a man, whether we base our understanding on self-identification or social recognition or birth assignation, where different genderqueer and trans folks fit, and figuring out who was socialised how, and ending hierarchy and alienation in all their forms will require strategies more liberating than identity politics. But let's be realistic. Distinct patterns of oppressive behaviour and power still fall pretty predictably among gender lines. If gender-based organising can help dislodge those patterns, perhaps we must embrace that contradiction and do our best to engage with it in all its messy complexity. Beyond the question of gendered organising in principle, there are other possible problems with this approach. Without subscribing to the notion that there are good anarchist men who are not the sexual assaulters we need to worry about, we can acknowledge that the folk who might benefit most from examining their sexist behaviour will likely be least inclined to participate. Also, participating in a formal men's group could be a way for sexists to gain legitimacy, diverting attention from their crappy behaviour by waving their feminist ally membership cards at people who call them out. And if the focus on gender-based organising privileged men's groups, even anti-sexist ones, over autonomous women and or trans organising, that could stabilise rather than challenge patriarchal power relations in the scene. Direction 3. Not accountability, but conflict resolution. Our struggles for accountability suffer because we have so few models, methods or skills for resolving conflicts among ourselves. While it's admirable that we've put so much energy into figuring out strategies for responding to assault and abuse, there are innumerable other kinds of conflict and problematic behaviours that we also need tools to address. And, as we've seen, the sexual assault specific accountability methodologies aren't appropriate in dissimilar situations. What if we prioritise building our conflict resolution and mediation skills? Of course, there are specific issues relevant to sexual assault and abuse, and these shouldn't be eclipsed in a general focus on conflict resolution. But if there is a precedent, language and skill set for addressing a wide range of conflicts and harm, and being asked to participate in a conflict resolution process becomes common and less threatening, perhaps we will be able to respond less defensively when we learn that our actions have hurt others. Rather than extending the identity politics of survivor and perpetrator, we could create more nuanced language that neither idealises nor demonises people, but asks all of us to remain engaged in lifelong processes of self-transformation. This requires empathy towards folks who have done harm, to create space for them to own up to their behaviours and heal. What are the advantages of framing sexual assault accountability processes within a broader emphasis on conflict resolution? There would be no need for a definitional hierarchy or limitless test to determine what counts as serious assault or abuse. By setting a precedent of collective engagement with less intense conflict, we would gain valuable experience to serve us in crisis situations. Framing conflict resolution as a collective responsibility could prevent the emergence of a specialised class of people who always facilitate these processes and make it easier to find supporters with sufficient distance from a situation to be able to mediate neutrally. One cautionary point needs to be made very clearly. Mediation is not appropriate for many cases of partner abuse. The article Thinking Through Perpetrator Accountability lays it out. Mediation should not be used as a substitution for accountability process. Mediation is for two people having a conflict that needs to be resolved. Abuse is not mutual. Abuse is not simply about two people needing to come to the table and work things out. Mediators may certainly be useful for helping to facilitate some of the concrete negotiations within an accountability process, but please do not suggest a session with a mediator as an option instead of a long-term commitment to an accountability process. Counsellors for domestic violence survivors learn that couples counselling should not be undertaken in a clear situation of partner abuse, because abusers will usually manipulate the process, leaving the abusive and unequal dynamics underlying the relationship unaddressed. This is important to bear in mind so that a shift to a conflict resolution framework isn't applied to situations of abusive relationships. What about the other disadvantages? Well, there's still the problem of responding to existing problems by prescribing solutions that demand skills or resources we don't have. What can we do in the meantime while undertaking the long-term work of learning how to resolve our conflicts? Survivors might feel frustrated to see assault and abuse lumped in with less intense or politically significant conflicts, minimising the harm they've experienced. Asking survivors to use less forceful language when addressing perpetrators could reinforce the survivor blaming messages that they are overreacting. That sexual assault is not a significant issue worth naming strongly. Also, male experts in conflict resolution could hijack survivor support work and divert its feminist focus. We must acknowledge the specific context of sexual assault and abuse, honour the pain and rage of survivors, and account for oppressive power while broadening the range of conflicts that we can address. Direction 4. Concentric circles of affinity. Quote, "There is no such thing as accountability within radical communities because there is no such thing as community, not when it comes to sexual assault and abuse. Take an honest survey sometime and you will find that we don't agree. There is no consensus. Community in this context is a mythical, frequently invoked and much misused term. I don't want to be invested in it anymore." That was Angustia Celeste from Safety is an Illusion, Reflections on Accountability. At the heart of all these questions lies one unresolved problem. What is community? Are we in one together as anarchists, as punks, as people in a certain local scene? Because we're at the same protest, show or mass mobilisation? Do we choose to be in it, or are we in it whether we like it or not, regardless of how we identify? And who decides all this? You can't have community accountability without community. The entire transformative justice framework falls apart without some coherent sense of what community means. But Unfortunately, no one seems to be able to answer this question for our milieu. And without an answer, we find ourselves banging our heads against the wall again and again when a slimy assaulter just skips town or drops out of the scene after being called out. Or when someone wields enough power in a scene to gerrymander the boundaries of community to exclude survivors and allies. This is not an abstract question. It's fundamental to what we do and how power operates in our scenes. Community becomes concrete through specific institutions such as the websites, gatherings, social centres and collective houses that comprise the North American anarchist scene. Although no one is taking attendance, except possibly the FBI, and many of us quarrel about who counts as a real anarchist, those of us who move through these spaces have a sense of being part of something. We weave together this sense through shared practices that mark us as teammates, dress and body modification, quirks of diet and hygiene conversation with specialised lingo and points of reference. But is being part of an anarchist milieu enough of a basis for the kind of community demanded by these accountability strategies? Can we realistically apply these models to our diffuse, fragmented, mostly unstructured associations of misfits? As we move through our lives, navigating connections with friends, neighbours and comrades, we are not just part of a single, unitary community, or even a web of multiple communities. Rather, our relationships with others take the form of concentric circles of affinity. From these, we can trace a tentative model to imagine how to apply community accountability models to anarchist scenes. One of the major flaws in our notion of anarchist community lies in its nature as implicit and assumed, rather than explicit and articulated. We don't often directly state our commitments to and expectations of the other people with whom we share various kinds of community, except in the specific projects or collectives. For instance, by living together, housemates agree to pay bills on time, wash the dishes and respect each other's space. What if we extended that degree of explicit intention to all of our relationships of affinity? Impossible. We're supposed to sit down with every anarchist in North America, or even just sit down in our town and spell out explicit standards for how we relate and what we expect from each other? No, of course not. And that's exactly the point. We can't do that. So we have to figure out how to collectively determine these things within the different webs of relationships in our lives. Rather than presuming a community and attempting to hold people accountable based on that fiction, we should define our expectations of and commitments to the others in our various circles of affinity and use them as the basis for our responses to conflict and harm. For example, excuse me, let's say that as my innermost concentric circle, I have my affinity group. These are the folks I trust the most, with whom I take risks and for whom I'll do whatever it takes. I'd be willing to give these people the benefit of the doubt in resolving conflict and addressing harm far more than any other people. Under this model, I would sit down with my affinity group and preemptively discuss how to address conflicts with each other when they come up, ranging from the most minor to the most serious disputes and forms of harm. Think of it as a sort of prenuptial agreement for friends and comrades, covering the bases in case things should go wrong. That way, I have a clear sense of how to respond when one of my crew does me wrong, and a shared basis of trust for working with them in a potentially long-term process of transformation. While I... excuse me. While I wouldn't extend that trust to most people within this group, we share a deep and explicit affinity, so I'll be more open to criticism, calling out and transformation with the trust that my comrades will be too. Other examples of this innermost circle or affinity might be families, birth or chosen, houses and land projects, various types of collectives or tight-knit groups of friends. The next circle outwards might be a shared community space, such as an info shop or social centre. It's a fairly consistent group of people, some of whom I'm closer with than others, but also an open space, so folks may come that I don't know. Since it's not a totally fixed group, and not every single person can or would settle on direct agreements with one another, there can be collective agreements around respect, consent, anti-oppression, use of resources and such. These don't have to be authoritarian, they can be collectively determined, revised at any time by the consent of those most affected, and no one is compelled to abide by them. Folks who can't or won't can choose not to participate in the space. As a result, I would be willing to go along with trying to hold someone accountable insofar as they wanted to continue to participate in the space. Since what defines our community, the terms of our affinity with each other, is our shared experience of participation in the space. Then, if one of us ceases to participate in it, we're no longer in community with one another, thus shouldn't expect them to be held or hold others accountable through it. And accordingly, if someone violates or refuses to abide by the collective standards, there's a procedure in place by which someone can be held accountable for their actions, and if they refuse, others can exclude them from the space in good conscience. Other examples of this second circle of affinity could include specific events, larger organising projects, and folks who hang out loosely in shared social spaces. This framework of concentric circles of affinity helps us imagine where we can best apply the accountability practices with which we've been experimenting these past few years among anarchists. As the circles move outwards to mass mobilisations, anarchists, punks, and our broader radical community, it's harder to imagine how we could concretely define community and navigate accountability within it. There's no reason to expect anyone to be accountable to us based on whatever abstraction we claim to share with them, without a concrete basis. Our community has neither carrot nor stick. We can't reward people for going along with our demands, and we can't coerce them into doing so. So, if some random person who's supposedly an anarchist sexually assaults someone, it might not be realistic to approach our response to the situation in terms of community accountability. So then, what do we do? Call the cops? Beat them up? Kick them out of all the institutions controlled by folks with whom we share affinity? And how do we deal with the recurrent problem of people who leave one scene only to resume abusive behaviour in another? We don't have any clear answers, but we have to start having discussions in every circle of affinity about our terms of engagement and how to address harm and resolve conflict before we're in crisis and forced to figure it out as we go. Until we've done that thoroughly in every collective, every space, every social group, and other anarchist formation, we can't realistically aspire to formal community accountability as a strategy for dealing with our shit. Excuse me. Forming affinity groups is a crucial part of anarchist organising. It can be as simple as putting together a crew of friends to do an action, or as formal and structured as you can imagine. Crucially, it preserves the basic principle of voluntary association at the heart of anarchy. The idea that we can do what we want with whomever we want without coercion or bureaucracy. This simple process has formed the core of our actions at demos and mobilisations, but perhaps we can use it to conceptualise our entire anarchist community and milieu. If we can create stronger ties with each other and understand our affinities more concretely, perhaps we'll have the basis to make community accountability something more than just a vague and contentious dream. Goodness me. We hope this essay will contribute to self-reflection among anarchists. Excuse me. We hope this essay will contribute to self-reflection among anarchists about where our affinities really are. Perhaps we can address many of the pitfalls of our experiments with accountability processes thus far by making our expectations of and commitments to one another as explicit as possible. We also can consider extending survivor-led vigilantism, pursuing anti-sexist men's groups, and gender-based organising to undermine rape culture, or broadening our focus on conflict resolution and mediation. Whatever paths we choose, anarchists must continue trying whatever we can to break this impasse around abuse and assault in our scenes. Our liberation depends on it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That's the end of my part 5. The next part of an anarchist approach to crime and justice is actually part 2 of this zine, What About The Rapist? And we shall pick this up another day. Thanks for listening. Love and light. If you make any comments or get into any discussions or debate with anybody in the comments, please be kind, please be polite and respectful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.